You may have seen the story about how back in the day, Harvard scientists were paid a large amount of money to, according to them, suppress the results on how related to certain health problems sugar is.
In 2007, a dentist turned researcher named Kristen Kearns was sifting through the basement archives of a defunct sugar company in Colorado. She wasn't hunting for a scandal. She was just looking for anything that might explain why so much of what she'd learned about nutrition didn't seem to add up. What she found, buried in dusty boxes that executives had forgotten to destroy, were 1,500 pages of internal memos, correspondence, and financial records. They had been sitting there for 40 years. And within those pages was the blueprint for one of the most consequential deceptions in the history of public health. The documents revealed that in the 1960s, the sugar industry had looked at the emerging science linking sugar to heart disease and decided to do what any threatened industry might do. But they didn't just run ads. They didn't just lobby. They paid a group of scientists at Harvard to write a literature review that would redirect the entire global conversation away from sugar and onto a different culprit entirely. That review, published in 1967 in the New England Journal of Medicine, systematically dismissed the dangers of sugar and declared with certainty that the only dietary intervention needed to prevent heart disease was to cut out fat, saturated fat. The funding from the Sugar Research Foundation was never disclosed, not to the journal, not to the public. And for the next 50 years, that single paper became the cornerstone of government dietary guidelines, the low-fat food movement, and the architecture of the modern supermarket. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to a moment when the science was genuinely unsettled. In the 1950s, there was a fierce debate over what was driving the rapid rise in heart disease. On one side was Ancel Keys, a powerful physiologist at the University of Minnesota, who argued that dietary fat raised cholesterol and that cholesterol killed people. On the other side was a British professor named John Yudkin, whose research pointed in a very different direction. Yudkin had found that sugar, not fat, was associated with rising blood fats, insulin resistance, and heart attacks. Both men had data. Both had supporters. The question should have been resolved by more research. But the sugar industry saw the debate as an existential threat, and they had no intention of waiting for an answer they might not like. The plan they set in motion was called Project 226. The strategy was simple. Don't attack the scientists who are criticizing sugar. Instead, fund a counter-narrative so authoritative, so prestigious, that it drowns them out. John Hickson, the Sugar Research Foundation's Vice President and Director of Research, was the architect. In internal memos, he warned that the industry was facing a threat from negative attitudes towards sugar, and that a major program was needed to refute our detractors. He personally approached Dr. Frederick Stare, the founder of Harvard's Department of Nutrition, and brought him onto the industry's scientific advisory board. Then, Hickson and his team identified the specific studies they considered dangerous, papers by Yudkin and other researchers, and handed them to the Harvard team with instructions. The lead author chosen for this operation was Dr. Mark Hegsted, a professor at Harvard. The Sugar Research Foundation paid Hegsted and his colleagues a total of $6,500 in 1965. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $67,000 today. But the money bought far more than just a review. The industry reviewed drafts before publication. They suggested revisions. When a new study emerged that implicated sugar, Hegsted wrote to Hickson, assuring him that they were reworking a section in rebuttal. The two-part review was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1967, a journal considered so authoritative that its conclusions could set policy for decades. The paper concluded there was no doubt that dietary fat was the problem, and it dismissed the sugar research as containing questionable data and incorrect interpretation. The journal's editors had no idea the study had been paid for by the sugar industry, because disclosure standards at the time were virtually non-existent. The NEJM wouldn't adopt a formal conflict of interest policy until 1984. The review passed as objective science, carrying the full weight of Harvard's name, and it immediately became the reference point for every subsequent dietary recommendation. John Yudkin became a primary target. His book, Pure, White and Deadly, published in 1972, was a comprehensive argument that sugar was the main cause of cavities, obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. Ancel Keys, whose career was deeply invested in the fat hypothesis, publicly mocked Yudkin's work as a mountain of nonsense, and used his influence to block Yudkin from speaking at international conferences. Yudkin's funding was cut. His invitations were rescinded. He was forced into early retirement and died in 1995 with his reputation in ruins. It wasn't until the 2000s, after the anti-sugar documentary wave, his insight that fructose drives fat production in the liver, once dismissed as fringe, is now foundational to our understanding of metabolic disease. His work was now recognized as ahead of his time. He was right. He was destroyed for being right. And the people who helped destroy him were, in some cases, on the payroll of the industry he was threatening. In 1977, a Senate committee chaired by George McGovern produced the first ever dietary goals for the United States. The initial draft suggested reducing meat consumption. Mark Hegsted, the same scientist who had co-authored the undisclosed industry-funded review a decade earlier, was now head of nutrition at the USDA and helped write those very guidelines. The 1980 Dietary Guidelines for Americans declared fat reduction a national priority, with calories from sugar mentioned only in passing. When the government told Americans to eat less fat, the food industry listened, not to make people healthier, but to maintain profits. The problem is that if you remove fat from processed foods, you remove much of their flavor and texture. To make those foods palatable again, manufacturers turned to sugar, refined starches, and high fructose corn syrup. The launch of Snackwell's cookies in 1992 became the perfect symbol of this era. They were labeled fat-free and sold in green packaging that screamed health. But they were packed with sugar and refined carbohydrates. People bought them by the carton, believing they were doing the right thing, often eating far more than they otherwise would have. The rise of high fructose corn syrup tracks this shift almost perfectly. HFCS entered the US food supply at scale in the 1970s and exploded just as the low-fat craze peaked. In 1970, the per capita availability of HFCS was half a pound. By 1980, it was 19 pounds. By 1990, nearly 50 pounds. By the year 2000, it hit 62.5 pounds. Over that same period, the adult obesity rate climbed from around 15% to over 30%. The American Heart Association, meanwhile, launched its Heart Check certification program in 1995, allowing companies to pay for a seal of approval on foods that were low in fat and cholesterol, but often still loaded with sugar. Cereals, juices, and snacks received a health halo, reinforcing the message that fat was the enemy and sugar was at worst neutral, empty calories. The structural protection of the sugar industry extended far deeper than marketing. The US government has long maintained price supports and import quotas that keep domestic sugar prices artificially high, guaranteeing a stable revenue stream for the biggest producers. These same interests are major political donors, ensuring that sugar remains politically difficult to regulate. In 2025, the beverage industry alone spent over $1.5 million in just 6 months on lobbying efforts aimed at preventing restrictions on sugary drinks in federal programs. The playbook was not unique to sugar, and it didn't originate with tobacco either. Robert Hockett, who served as scientific director of the Sugar Research Foundation during its formative years, left the SRF in 1954 and moved directly to the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, where he deployed the identical strategy. The "doubt is our product" philosophy that would later define Big Tobacco's decades-long defense of cigarettes was already operational in the sugar industry first. The model ran 3 steps. Fund literature reviews at elite institutions to discredit independent research showing harm. Cultivate prominent scientists willing to lend their names to industry-favorable conclusions. Then use the resulting appearance of scientific uncertainty to paralyze regulators, because regulatory bodies cannot act on a question that appears unresolved. The whole edifice stood undisturbed until Kristin Kearns opened those boxes. Her findings, co-authored with researchers at UCSF, were published in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2016. The paper explicitly documented how the Sugar Research Foundation had initiated, funded, and shaped the 1967 review, and how that review had provided the scientific foundation for decades of anti-fat policy. The Sugar Association's response was that journals didn't require disclosure back then, as if that addressed the deliberate concealment. In the years that followed, independent research overwhelmingly confirmed what Yudkin and others had argued. The 2025 to 2030 dietary guidelines for the first time imposed strict limits on added sugar. No more than 10 grams per meal, 50 grams per day. The FDA's new Human Foods Program, expected to be fully operational by mid-2026, is targeting hidden sugars and ultra-processed additives. Dozens of cities have passed taxes on sugary drinks, and consumption has measurably declined. Yet the consequences remain embedded in the population. The epidemic of obesity and metabolic disease that the low-fat era helped catalyze didn't simply reverse. It became one of the great chronic health crises of the 21st century. The explosive demand for GLP-1 drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy in 2025 and 2026 is a direct market response to the very conditions that were inadvertently worsened by a dietary paradigm designed to prevent something else. The sugar industry didn't just sell a product, it sold a scientific story. And that story became the architecture of daily life for millions of people who had no idea they were eating according to a script written by the people who fed them. So when you walk through a grocery store now and you see a label that says low fat or fat free, what you're really looking at is the residue of a 50-year-old business decision, not a medical one, not a nutritional consensus that arrived naturally, an industrial strategy drawn up in a boardroom, laundered through the most prestigious scientific institutions in the world, and sold to the public as health advice. The truth was always there, buried in a basement in Colorado, waiting for someone to ask the right question. And the question wasn't really whether sugar was dangerous, it was who decided that you should stop being afraid of it, and why they needed you to believe something else so badly. The answer changes not just how you think about breakfast, but how you see the entire system that tells you what is good for you.